everyone, welcome back to Truth Talks. We have Leigh St John with us, coach to high-level entrepreneurs, and it's an honor to be able to have this call for with him for free. I have no doubt he charges a lot for this, but yeah, we're piggybacking off the podcast. Leigh, really glad to have you here. For those that don't know you, would you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. So my name's Leigh St John, and I'm a coach to high performers who are aware that they've built a beautiful life, but they're still full of stress, constant cortisol, adrenaline, burnout, and they just feel a sense that, man, is this it? Is this what I signed up for? Is this what I was grinding for to still feel the same way? So what I help them do is to systematically unpack their operating system or their belief systems that have kept them stuck in essentially survival mode. And yeah, the way that I do that is in my Inner Shrine program. I've developed my own mindfulness and meditation system called SenseFlow, which is it's a sort of neuroscience based somatic mindfulness system. It's remarkably powerful. And I use that along with all of the other tools to help these high level dudes really step into a different level of feeling incredible, but also a different level of performance as well. When we switch from force and forcing our way through life to flowing through life, life gets infinitely sweeter and more effective, more efficient, more empowered. So that is the essence of what I do. I've been practicing meditation and mindfulness now for 17 years. I've been on the path ever since I lost my dad when I was 18 years old to cancer. So that was the catalyst for doing what I do. And, it's a funny thing because in that loss, I realized that what my passion is, and this might sound quite odd to some, is human suffering. And my joy is helping people to see through the underlying roots of suffering, because suffering is not natural. It's conditioned. And it's self-created through these unconscious conditions that we aren't even aware that we're operating within. And my joy is to help people unpack that and just to see the joy of, it's like how Jesus said, until you turn and become like little children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Seeing them come back to this childlike innocence and joy and natural presence. And with that, all of the performance benefits that you get as well. So that's a long-winded way of introducing myself, brother. But yeah. Can I just confirm, brother,
Yeah,
how do I say your name
it's
correctly?
it's Neeramitra. Usually the Europeans get my name right from the get-go. The Indians don't get it right. The Americans don't get it right, but somehow the Europeans get it right. So it's an interesting and it's beautiful the things you touched upon, and especially the power versus force. I mean, you must be familiar with it, right? From the David Hawkins way of looking at it. So
Yes.
how do you think your system maps into that essentially?
Well, I would say that like the vast majority of people who come to me initially, a lot of them are high level guys, but they have a deep interest in spirituality. They have a deep interest in meditation and mindfulness, for example. And they know because they've tasted it that there's something more. There's something beyond this constant stress and this background hum of anxious dissatisfaction that is the normal baseline state for so many people. They've tasted it. They've tasted these moments of flow where everything feels effortless. And in those moments, instead of everything coming crumbling down, which is the assumption that a lot of high performers have, actually they perform radically more efficiently and powerfully. And they had this sense of like, wow, if I could just operate from here, then life would be radically sweeter. So they've tasted it. They know that that level of performance and feeling good is an option, but they struggle to access it because what I've noticed for many men is that mindfulness becomes actually another source of anxiety. It becomes another thing to sort of batter themselves over the head with, to punish themselves with, because it remains primarily mental.
Mm.
It's another thing to think about instead of to embody and to bring into daily life in a way that produces real and genuine lasting transformation. A lot of these guys, when they initially come to me, they're sort of at the level of courage, but they dip down into pride, into anger, into anxiety and fear far more often than they would like to. So what we do is we start to, first of all, we build a foundation with SenseFlow, a foundation of awareness and a foundation of acceptance. And through that foundation and that increased metacognition, which is the capacity to just be aware of what's going on in your inner world, we start to map out the conditions for the stress and anxiety. And, people are not always comfortable with this, but we have to recognize this and embrace it if you want to really profoundly transform. It all goes back to childhood. It all goes back to childhood. And those first 7 years of life where we are essentially in a state of hypnosis, downloading all of these fear-based, lack-based programs from mum and dad, reinforced by society. That becomes our default operating system. But as we start to remove those, what happens is their level of consciousness starts to naturally rise. And so they go from being down in fear or anxiety up into courage, up into willingness, up into acceptance. And when we start to taste the freedom that acceptance can bring us, then we start to realize that dedicating ourselves to living in this way is the most logical way to be, because you feel infinitely better and you perform infinitely better. That's it. It's a no-brainer, right? It's like, feel great, perform great. All of the other stuff that you were living
That's
with melts away. Yeah, so that's kind of how it fits in. I do reference Hawkins's book a lot. I've got Letting Go back there. And I specifically ask
yeah.
clients when they first join to go and read the first 3 chapters, because the reality is that we are very emotionally illiterate as a society. What we tend to do is to suppress the emotions, to push them down, to reject them, especially as a man. Okay, anger is permissible because it feels strong and powerful, but what is anger actually masking? Very often it's masking, and this is coming from a guy who punched a hole through his wall when he was 18, and did all kinds of very naughty things from a place of anger. Anger is very often masking these deeper emotions of fear, of shame, guilt, resentment. Ultimately, it all comes back to fear. Yeah, so that's kind of how it fits into the system, in a way. Yeah, and we do use the map as a sort of a loose guide, just to kind of map where it is. David Hawkins, God bless his soul, he's such a wonderful guide on this path. He maps what each stage looks like so powerfully. And in my own experience, kind of going up and down and all through the different stages, the way that he's mapped it exactly mirrors my experience. And that points to a profound truth, which is the human ego. Although we like to sort of think that we're very unique, and perhaps even our suffering is unique, what I found in working with over 45 high performers and observing myself for 17 years obsessively and seeing it in others is that actually our suffering is quite uniform in many ways. And it all comes back to fear, shame, and should. So,
Very
yeah,
interesting.
that's kind of how it fits into the system.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I was wondering if you were to talk about the power levels, for example, there's shame,
Mm,
there's fear, there's pride, and there's anger, which comes below pride and so on, right? Until the point of the tipping point where it turns into courage, acceptance, and willingness. Generally speaking, when you're starting to enter the realms of power, for example, would
mm.
it be right in saying that there is a tangible dip in real world success for a while, tangible dip in these things that the society celebrates? Because based on my experience so far, I think the society today is wired to at least materially reward force, essentially, materially reward pride. If you look at certain influences like Andrew Tate and the ones who are sort of at the top of the material, you can see that what they're embodying is essentially pride. So, given that I used to be, for my peer group and my age group, I was considered a high performer. And since I can totally relate with what you're talking about, when I started stepping into realms of power, I just saw a stripping away of so many powerful motivators or drivers to maniacally attack something.
Yeah.
Because I was used to working with a lot of force. So I was wondering, how do you tackle this practically?
That's a great question. And I think what you're touching on is definitely a thing to be considered. The problem is, and it's funny you mentioned Andrew Tate, because look, I think Andrew Tate has his place. Because for men who are down at the level of shame, and I was talking to a former client about this, a client who was previously on antidepressants. And he told me yesterday very candidly, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind me sharing this, and I'll keep him anonymous. But he said that before I started working with you, any time that I would go unconscious, I would start thinking about, unaliving myself, he put it. He was living in deep shame. And for somebody who's down at the level of shame, having Andrew Tate being like, dun, 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 you got to get up and you've got to do this and you've got to, come on, Brokey, you got to go. Like, I don't watch much Tate, but I think he's hilarious and I think he has his place, like I say. That can motivate you up into the level of anger and pride, which is a significant upgrade over being down in shame and
Mm,
fear. But ultimately, if you're operating at the levels of anger and pride, it's like Uncle Iroh in Avatar said, pride is not the antidote to shame, but its source. So whenever you're playing the game of pride, yes, it's more powerful than being down in shame, but it is so tangibly linked to shame. And you
mm,
are essentially living based on external results. You talk to a beautiful woman, you feel full of pride. You get rejected, now you're full of shame. You
mm,
achieve something in business, you are full of pride, something goes wrong, and you are full of shame, and you're on this seesaw back and forth. And you are essentially at the whims and mercies of uncertainty and of whatever happens out there, because we can't control what happens out there. So it's actually a very disempowering way to live. And sure, you can sort of psych yourself up and you'd be like, come on, let's go, and sort of charge up the power level, as it were. But it's always going to carry this degree of inauthenticity. Where you're going to realize, there'll be a point where you realize, am I truly being who I am? Or am I still operating in that same paradigm of who I think I should be to get love, to get acceptance, to feel like I'm enough? So I think when we're operating below 200, even above 200 for a while, we're still ultimately operating to try to feel like we're worthy and that we are enough. And that is bullshit. It's very painful because this is the huge recognition at the level of acceptance, for example, is that I always was enough. It's just that I had these belief systems that were put in place before I had a chance to audit them and say, no, thank you, installed by parents and society, that made me feel like I wasn't enough. But we, at the level of acceptance, perhaps, or even love, we can start to see our own innate innocence, and that we are, in the eyes of God, always going to be infinitely loved, no matter what we achieve, do, what kind of girl we speak to, whatever. Right? It's when we tap into that sense of our own innate lovableness, our innate wholeness, that we realize the redundancy of operating down at the level of something like anger or pride. It has its place, but don't get stuck there. For me, on my journey, anger is the same thing. Anger and pride were useful until they weren't. Don't get stuck there. Don't make it your identity, being some sort of whatever, some Andrew Tate wannabe. Have the courage to let go of that and go beyond and see what your true authentic expression is. See what your true joy is. It's useful to model somebody else for a bit, but that can become a prison in of itself. See where it can take you if you let go of that.
Would you say that the upgrade from levels such as shame or anger or the lower levels essentially, do you think the upgrade is linear? Does it have to be that shame turns into grief and then grief into fear and then fear into anger and pride and then courage? Or do you think there is a chance that there can be a significant upgrade, let's say from shame directly up into the levels of courage and acceptance and willingness? And can that be sustained? Or how does it practically pan out generally?
That's a great question. I think you can certainly leap. You can play around. You could jump in between different levels of consciousness. I think if you're at a level of shame, kind of going up in a linear fashion can be quite powerful. One of the things I'll do with clients if they are down at a level of shame is intentionally trigger them. And they're like, oh, I don't know, because they'll be like, oh, I don't have any energy. You can't. Now, generally, these days, I don't work with guys who are at that level anymore. But I used to when I was starting out. And they'll be like, I have no energy. I can't do it. And I'd say something like, well, why don't you just stop being a motherfucking bitch? And they're like, what? And you could see the anger and the energy rise up in them, and all of a sudden they sit up a bit straighter. Their posture gets back a bit, and and all of a sudden they're full of energy. And I'm like, there it is. There's that energy. See, it was always within you. You were just too stuck down in the prison of being nothing. See, now you've got energy. All right, now can you feel that anger fully? Can you feel through it? Can you forgive yourself? Can you work through this anger? Let it be. Let it race and roar through you. Come up to the level of courage now. And so, you can intentionally bring people up. And I think that can be a very powerful tool as well. Yeah. So I think, as to your question, I think everybody's path is ultimately unique, and it depends on the individual's karma, on their many different factors. Yeah, everybody's path is unique, but you can certainly jump up. Why not? Is it sustainable? Probably not, I would imagine, because generally, if it's still, I like to think about it like this. The degree to which you worry about the future is the degree to which you've got this unliberated stuff in the past. And you can imagine it literally as if you've got this energetic cord to something in the past. Maybe it's the time where someone betrayed you, or you betrayed someone, or that time when mum said something to you which was particularly cutting, or whatever it may be. Those scenarios that when you're driving in your car, they randomly come up, bubble to the surface, and you're replaying them. Those are an invitation to go and dissolve that energetic tether. And when you do that, that energy that was trapped in the past comes back to you in the now. So the process from going from a lower level of consciousness to a higher level of consciousness is a reclaiming of energy, partially. That's not all that it is, but that's a huge part of it. And until you do that, your ego is going to be so scattered, and it's going to have so many conflicting desires and so many conflicting points of view that it's going to be really difficult to kind of unite it. I call this uniting the ego under a single banner. So for me, that was meditation. That was my banner. That was what I was willing to give my all to. And all of my ego was on board with that. Because the ego is a very fragmented, scattered thing. It has many different parts. So reclaiming the energy and bringing the parts all together and say, right, this is what resonates to me as a mission. And that might change, but that is a vital thing to do. And there's so much energy that's gained in doing that.
Isn't this what's called, let's say, self-integration? I think this is the work that's being done where different fragments stuck in the past and stuck in other people, especially in 12-step circles, the word used is reclaiming our power from
Mm.
others and from the past. I think that's what you're referring to, right? When we just reclaim these energetic cords that are just siphoning energy away from us into the past, which doesn't exist. So that's like a sink of sorts for energy where it's going nowhere essentially. And it's also stuck with other people because we have these connections with everyone. But then it's interesting that you mention uniting the ego under one banner.
Mm.
So this interplay with the ego is interesting. A lot of people talk about ego death and ego dissolution, but then the question becomes who's trying to kill the ego? The ego is trying to kill itself. So that's I've begun realizing that when people refer to ego death in a forceful, self-orchestrated sense, it's much likelier to be an ego suicide of sorts or an attempt rather than a true ego death. So do you believe that even this escalation in consciousness after a point, is it really free will that can we choose to continuously embody higher levels of consciousness, or does there come a point where our karma has to play out, life has to play out to sustain us in those levels? Essentially the destiny versus free will argument regarding consciousness level itself. I would love to know what you think.
Well, higher levels of consciousness are not something that you force your way into or attempt to be in. Higher levels of consciousness naturally emerge when you let go of everything that's holding you down at a lower level of consciousness. And any attempt to wrangle your way into a higher level of consciousness is inauthentic. Of course, we can practice things like loving kindness or like gratitude, which bring us up into a different level. But if we're talking about the baseline level, bringing it up, for it to be sustainable, it's really a case of letting go. A Course in Miracles, 12 Step, David Hawkins, Jesus Christ, the Buddha, all of these traditions, they're essentially pointing you towards letting go of these fixed views or beliefs about yourself or the world that brings you down into assumption and ignorance. Like right now, if I were to sit here and to be Leigh, who's doing a podcast with you on Zoom, I'm in Malaysia, you are in India, right? And then there's a ring light here, and like all of that, those are just names, those are just concepts. And of course, concepts have their place, but what's the tangible experience if we let go of all of those concepts and fixed views? What do we experience in the absence of all the knowing that we have, which ultimately manifests as a form of tension in the body-mind system? What's left over? And it's just this innocent, fresh wholeness. That's what we directly experience. Innocent freshness.
That's beautiful. That's a term that will stick with me for a long, long time. Innocent freshness is describes it beautifully. In some way, you're describing the inner child, right? If you were to go off on a tangent and describe the inner family system, because that's some work I'm doing lately, and it's fascinating how the whole way of looking at it. That at some point we are not parented right, as you said, when you're growing up, and then the inner child, the inner teenager, sort of becomes this rebellious, prideful, vengeful, protector of the inner child, and it continues doing that. And we, as the inner parent, have to gently, reparent ourselves. And especially in the beginning, there's generally a dip in ambition because I experienced that after my first Vipassana course, etc. Many things that are holding me up, the drivers for making a lot of money or just accumulating a lot of power. When I say power, I mean it's force actually, but we don't realize that it's actually force that we're talking about. Power as the material world calls it. That space somehow seems like regress of sorts that I'm falling behind. On good days, I do understand. I think we all do understand. You probably have experience with your clients as well. I'd love to know how you guide them through those initial phases where there is a sense of feeling that I'm losing my drive, I'm losing my fire to achieve, to pull like 18-hour work days and the like.
Yeah. Well, it's always, I think it's really, really important for us to analyze, am I doing an 18-hour workday because it's authentically giving me joy? It's leading me to my highest purpose? Or am I doing it from a place of lack and believing that unless I do the 18-hour workday, then I'm a piece of shit and it's confirmed in my own mind, which again is just a belief that we hold, which crystallized over time. And we can get into, childhood parenthood and how that kind of conditioned us to feel like we are insufficient in a bit. But I think, as to your question, what I find is that with clients, the focus switches from living outside in, where all of our self worth and our sense of being okay is determined by external things, validation, achievements, etc., to living inside out. And I think that this is perhaps one of the most critical shifts that a human being can possibly make, where we realize that what we are searching for in the 18-hour work days, in the grind set, in the whatever, is ultimately to feel whole, is to feel enough, is to touch that which is actually our very nature. And until we are in touch with our innate wholeness, again, we're going to be living in some degree of inauthenticity as we rush around trying to prove that we are enough, which is incredibly painful and it doesn't work. And that's how most people spend the majority of their lives until they get to a point where they're old enough where they think, oh, fucking hell, I can't be bothered doing this anymore. And they start gardening or painting. And, you see this a lot with people who are over 60. They either go one of two ways. They drop all the shoulds and they stop trying to prove themselves and they embrace they're kind of reborn, or they just sort of live in this like condensed, hardened, repetitive program, and that kind of just spirals into something like dementia or Alzheimer's. The more tension there is, the more hardness there is. You can see it in their eyes, right? They sort of crystallize. They're just in that program of not enoughness. So the big switch is when we start to live inside out and we realize that we are already whole. We are already enough. And that the main quest of this life is to raise awareness, to raise consciousness, to be more present, to be more loving, to be gentler, to be kinder, more compassionate to ourselves and to all other people. And we realized that when we do that, what we were seeking externally in the 18-hour workdays was always ours in the first place. So it's a huge shift in how we show up in the world. And now I'm not going to sit here and pretend that that doesn't necessarily shake things up a little bit initially. And I've seen this happen with, I've got one client, he's one of the biggest coaches on Twitter. When we started to dissolve the other, he realized pretty quickly through one of the meditations that we do that he had been trying to prove himself to his dad and his stepdad. And he had capped his own happiness, his own capacity to be free, to be present. And when he stopped doing that, he unlocked, and when he learned to really embrace and feel his emotions and allow them, boom, he hit a 40K week. Boom, his business went to all these whole new levels. And he experienced more abundance externally. He was able to achieve his goals in an effortless way. He even stopped drinking along the way, and that was just a consequence of it not resonating anymore. So yes, there's a shift from living like, I need this and I need that, and I want this from you, and I want you to see me this way, to letting go of all that and being like, no, all I need to do is to let go. My main quest is this: to feel amazing, to be loving, to be kind. And then my performance out there magically gets infinitely more powerful. Have you experienced that in your own life, Robert?
I have. It's beautiful. I was resonating a lot as you were talking about it. After in the first year or so after this shift started happening, I was not resonating with what I was doing online. Of course, there was the whole it's helping people angle, but then you just see that your being is not resonating with it anymore. Lately,
Mm.
I've awakened to the purpose which I think I'll be dedicating the next year or two to, and that demands the best of me. Earlier, I was trying to stay on no fab retention and all these practices. It was a means to an end which did not exist. It was just an end in itself. And then now I realize there is a purpose which demands something of me. And I'm not doing it to prove myself to anyone. I'm utterly detached to the outcome, whatever it may be. But then there is such a change in heart regarding all these things. Now I want to stay sexually celibate as much as I can because the energy is demanded. There's so much energy needed for this thing that I'm venturing out into. And there's such a love towards it. It's
Mm.
intrinsically motivating. Even I'm not able to articulate it yet, but then I can see how one thing that has happened is if I were to look at ambition levels and what I would allow myself to do, earlier the upper range was here and the lower was here. I wouldn't fall below this, I wouldn't rise above that. Now I realize both of them have just like blown away. The upper end doesn't exist anymore and the lower doesn't exist. Even if I fall, there is a sense of self forgiveness, and would you agree with that? And if that is the case, generally I've realized it can be risky in some way because the lower sorts of fall away unless there's a unifying purpose, a really strong connection to the divine, to our true self. We tend to fall away. So in the beginning stages, when this connection is just stabilizing, even now I'm at a stage where it's not really strong. When I have lows, they're really low. They're like low, low. But then when I have highs, they're just incredible. I feel liberated for those few nanoseconds. So this oscillation, have you seen it intensify by any chance, or do people do stabilize into it really well?
It's a great question, and thank you for sharing your experience. I appreciate that. So, yeah, what I find generally with the clients I work with, I would say that the baseline actually rises and then this disappears. Yeah. But again, everybody's journey is different. And there certainly are times where we come to terms with the depth that we have been living in shame in should. And that can be incredibly humbling. I had a client recently. He's a Bitcoin hedge fund manager, very wise guy, very tapped in. And he did a self-imposed meditation retreat. And he sort of said, wow, his conclusion was, I was living so much in this energy of should. And that's a humbling thing to come to terms with when you realize that pretty much 99% of your thoughts that randomly arise and pull your attention away come from this energy of should, which is shame. That's pretty intense. Yeah. But it's also an invitation to go deeper into the underlying belief system that is at play, which is causing you to feel that, which is causing the thoughts. Because the way I teach my guys is you have beliefs. The beliefs create tension in your mind body system. And that tension is what drives thoughts. 99% of thoughts are a waste product. There's no point getting wrapped up in them. Come down and learn to feel the feelings or the tension. Let it wash over you in the same way that you would let a cold shower wash over you. When we have those big dips, like you mentioned, very often it's because we're sort of at the edge of the shower, sort of putting our hand in and sort of pulling away and not truly just going straight into it and letting it wash over you. Because when you do that, things process really quickly, generally. And then once we've cleared out that tension, we can now go into the underlying belief system at play, which is always anchored into your mind and body, your body-mind system, unified system with this energy of should. I should be a certain way. My life should look different than it is. And whenever you're in this energy of should, you are inevitably living in resistance to what is in this moment. That's pain.
Yeah, I think the fundamental force to power shift happens when it changes from I should to I want to. And the wants aren't really logically rooted. I think, would it be right in saying that there is a certain truth, moment to moment, that the being itself keeps surfacing as long as you can look inwards? And as the whole point of life is to maybe heed that truth that's coming from within yourself. I've had this experience over and over in life since I was a child, and that's been guiding my path. The book Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse is sort of comes the closest to describing what I've experienced continually, this repeating shedding of identity, the utter destruction. I recently nuked my entire online ecosystem of products, offerings, and everything. And I felt real pain. There was a real death of something that I'd put for 4 or 5 years into because the new purpose demanded that. And yeah, I think this identity that we have to keep shedding, is it just the false identity? Is it just the false operating system, as you call it, that we're just letting go again and again and again? The way I've done it is I just happen to fall into really low states. Then there is a strong psychic charge that comes up. And that gives me the power or the force, whatever you want to call it, to take that move, which I generally don't have the courage to because I'm too attached to it. The times I've been down bad, I've gotten the psychic charge needed to let go of that one thing that's holding me down at that stage. And then there has been a baseline improvement, as you said. The baseline has shot up again. Is there a gentler way to do this? Is there a more self-loving way to do this? Because I find myself somehow falling back into those lows just so that I can get the energy to destroy whatever is holding me back and move ahead. But it does get exhausting after a point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So let me just clarify. There is this inclination to take authentic action towards something, but then there is an energetic blockage there.
Yeah, that would be
And it's the resistance of the blockage that brings you down into the lower state. Is that correct?
yeah, I think that would be right. There is such a strong desire to do heed what's right, what's true, but there is resistance and there is a lack of resolution between the two. There's a lot of dissonance.
Yeah, look, I really do think that everybody's path is different and that everybody inevitably will face darkness. And it's a prerequisite to coming out into your own personal light. But at the same time, this can be, with certain approaches, we can minimize this to a great degree. And that approach is really just grace. It's allowing yourself to suffer, not to judge it as being wrong or as being that you should be a different way than you are, but just truly allowing it and realizing that that too is sacred. And it's kind of the degree to which you allow it completely and fully is the degree to which you process it. When we resist it, it becomes our reality. If we resist anxiety, it becomes our reality. If we resist tension, it becomes our reality. We become a tense person. We become an anxious person. If we resist fear, we become a fearful person until that charge comes up and we sort of bounce back again. So if there is any way to, I don't want to say mitigate because this process is sacred, but if there is any way to approach this in a very loving way, it's simply just to completely allow it. It's the degree to which you get involved in the process, but you prevent it unfolding. It's like if you've got these little molecules of suffering, you sort of go in them and say, no, it shouldn't be like this, go away. And we resist it. So perhaps a better way to picture this is to imagine a pool of water that's fizzing up. And then we don't want the fizz, right? Because when it's clear, it looks beautiful, it accurately reflects reality. And when it's fizzing up, we try to smooth it out by putting our hand in and shaking it even more. Take out the hand. Let it fizz, let it do whatever it's doing, and it will die down by itself, or it will dissolve and settle by itself. Now that's courageous, to take a back seat and not micromanage, control, or try to alter anything, but just to completely allow whatever you are experiencing. That's real courage. That's real love. That's grace. Does that sort of resonate and feel like something that you could incorporate?
That's beautiful. It's what occurred to me was how, be it the Buddha or anyone, when they recommend the middle path, it's generally seen as a cop out. It's seen as a hedge to going all out. But as you put it beautifully now, the middle path is what actually requires courage, and it reminds me of what David Deda wrote in The Way of the Superior Man as well. It requires courage to be at your edge, to not overpush or to not, underplay it. And especially the achiever type personalities, they also tend to fall prey to vices. I can speak for myself and the friends I've seen who are those high A, topping throughout school, best college, best offers, and all that way of doing things. It's that when things are going well, you win, you win, you win, you win, you keep going upwards because you don't want to stop. You want to burn yourself out. It's like the moth that goes to the flame. But then when you start falling, you don't want to stop. You want to fall all the way down, hit rock bottom, then snap back to the top. And people do take their lives when this gets too intense. It's one of the things that the 12 steps addresses. This tendency to go all out, be it in constructive or destructive tendencies. And as Osho put it as well, the very thing, I think he explained it about retention and celibacy and sexual acting out essentially. He said the very thing that charges someone to act out degenerately is also the very thing that pushes them back to the celibacy. It's like a pendulum that's swinging from one end to the other. And as and when one extreme gets higher, as the highs get higher, the lows get lower. And I can imagine how the being is so fragmented dualistically, where I think the light gets lighter, the dark gets darker, and there is a sense of, I've been experiencing this a lot later, before I got into more shadow work and everything. I just hated myself more, I loved myself more, I thought of myself better, I thought of myself worse. But it's beautiful the way you put it. The middle path is what really is where courage really lies, is where power really lies. Would it be right in saying that holding on to this requires a guide, as you do, for example, or a fellowship, as the 12 steps provide? Or is it something that can be done via just devotion, via just practices by oneself, practically?
I think even if your guide is Eckhart Tolle on YouTube or Thich Nhat Hanh or David Hawkins in his books, you benefit immensely from that. Yeah, sure, you could stumble across it yourself, but the likelihood is that that's not going to happen. So it's really, really powerful to have a guide. It will massively accelerate your progress. Somebody who's walked that path before and who has, it's rather like if you were to climb a mountain, right? You would want a guide because there's potholes and there's areas where you can fall down, and there's kind of like you describe it. It's, you climb up high, but then you take a misstep, you're sliding all the way down, and just kind of repeating that. Having somebody who can see what's going on and to call you out on it and to suggest, hey, look, instead of, because I think that extreme that you're talking about there is that inside out way of living. Things are going great, I'm riding high. Things are going poorly, I'm down low. Pride and shame. Actually, it's all just shame, and fear. But yeah, having a guide could be massively helpful. I mean, for me, I don't know when the book is actually. Here it is. 1 second. For me, this was my initial guide.
That's beautiful. Isn't that a Paramahamsa Yogananda? Isn't that an Ananda Foundation book?
No, it's not. No, this is not Paramahansa Yogananda. It's Lahiri. I can't remember his name actually. Lahiri. Yes.
It's one of the gurus in the same lineage, I think, if I'm not wrong. Lahiri Mahasya, right?
I'm honestly not sure, brother, because it's been a long time. I never got into like the guru devotion side of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for me, that book was my guide. I just practiced it, followed its steps, and things started unfolding beautifully. After that, Buddhism became sort of the guide. And after that, I guess David Hawkins was very influential. But Nisargadatta Maharaj, and
Mm.
Ramana Maharshi are two of the greatest sages of India, right? And those two, I think, are incredibly powerful. So Nisargadatta's book, I Am That, became my sort of Bible. I was just reading it obsessively. And his primary teaching is to keep the sense of I am in mind at all times, to abide in it, not just to chant it emptily, but to abide in this sense of I am. And that became my guru in a sense. And I just kept in this I am, until something permanently shifted. So yeah, I think when I think about a guru or a guide, in my mind, I always go to Nisargadatta. He's very zen because he's just cuts through. He's like, no, like, there was these stories about how he'd sit people down at the front of his ashram or whatever, and he'd be like, okay, who are you? What have you done? What are your experiences? What are your beliefs? What do you hold on to? And he'd just dress people down until they were left with nothing. And then there's that chance for that I am to be directly experienced. Whereas Ramana Maharshi, you'd go and he would just sit there in silence and he would transmit in silence. So this beautiful contrast between these two very different men who were pointing at ultimately the same thing. So your guide can just be a book, it can be a YouTube channel. I just think that most important is to commit. Just commit. See where it takes you. Be fearless, be courageous, have grace, and be willing to see how deep the rabbit hole goes.
That's again two of the greatest gurus. Even documented consciousness levels are quite, I think, in the 700s for both of them. As David Hawkins has calibrated them. But would it be right in saying that the presence of a human being, let's say, transmits context, transmits consciousness itself? So, like when you work with clients, when you're embodying a higher level of consciousness, as you clearly are, I can experience it right now, then that helps, right? Like, let's say if you have a lot of compassion, I've realized the best guides, astrologically speaking, if you look at karmic tendencies and whatever little validity that has, I'm able to hold space. I do hold space for people, but then there are levels to it. I can only hold space for ones who are going through a suffering, which I have experienced myself. And there's a sort of compassionate space that's created. I realize the work I'm doing is that I'm holding this space of compassionate consciousness. That's it. And the work is sort of doing itself. So would
Mm.
it be right in saying part of the work you're doing, part of the value that you're bringing is literally your own presence, your own levels of consciousness into the, which does create that space for healing.
I'd say any time that any human being offers another human being space and genuine presence, healing occurs. Who's your best mate? It's really just the person who you feel the least amount of tension around, right? The least inauthenticity around, where you can just really be yourself around them, right? And so they, through their sort of non-judgmental, allow you to open up and to bloom and to flourish into the beautiful being that you are. That's what a best friend is. So yeah, I think any human being has this capacity to do this. It's interesting though, because I've noticed, particularly early on, clients would say, "Oh yeah, when I get on a call with you, I feel like really good." I mean, because I'm guiding them through certain practices or whatever. And then sometimes it's difficult to keep in mind that, oh yes, when they go off the call, they kind of have a come down, is what they reflected to me. And I was like, oh, okay, so the person who I'm speaking to in Telegram after we've had a call is not the same person who I experienced directly. And so that was a learning curve as well, and something which I've incorporated since learning that in the early days. Yeah. But 100% any human being has that capacity. Anytime that we are truly present for the moment, we step into something miraculous and we can experience this just as we're walking around, this innocent freshness that we tap into, this sense of like, wow. I mean, like yesterday, I really felt like I was reborn 100 different times. And just, whoa, what is this? Yeah. And we can always have that experience whenever we're willing to let go and to embrace a true beginner's mind and just to experience as if for the very first time.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think you're a beautiful human yourself, and there's definitely some effect that you're having, which this is by no means to stroke the ego, but just it is what it is. And I think that's beautiful because from my end also, when I first thought of speaking to you, in my head, so far I'd spoken to people who I would consider were peers in some way. But in you, I could see that you're more of a mentor figure. I know these are again constructs of the mind, but then you've made me feel very safe and comfortable and just that's beautiful. I feel blessed to be having this conversation with you. Like honestly, I mean it. And
Likewise,
coming
brother.
to even in terms of Twitter, let's say the whole Twitter space, I don't know how we do understand that consciousness transcends time and the resonance can happen on levels which aren't really connected spatially or temporally. But it's always fascinated me how just the right people seem to just get connected at the right time somehow, and it's one of those things that fuck none of this makes sense, and that's beautiful. It's a beautiful mystery. I mean, no matter how much you try to explain things, understand, I think no theory or anything even comes close to explaining the utter, absolute, ineffable mystery that life really is and how it's unfolding and even the paths and everything. It's really stunning. I think that's where I think the linear versus non-linear way of life comes in, that nothing happens and then everything happens versus let's say just scaling linearly, that you have an income goal. So I was wondering, with your greater experience with these things, do you think these two can be reconciled by any chance? That you do have goals, let's say, which are bounded by time, which is again a human construct. It's something we need to navigate life. For example, now I have a goal which it's a competitive exam. It's considered the world's toughest competitive exam,
Oh wow.
and the selection rate is 1 in 5,000. That's 0.002%, if I'm not wrong. So something like this, it is a linear goal, but I know something like this also demands the best of me, all of me. So
Wow.
there is a sense that God alone, when I say God, I mean the power, the dharma essentially, which governs everything. God alone can choose for me to have this. So whether or not make it through it is a different thing. But how can something like this be reconciled practically? That there is, because I'm certain you work with people who have a lot of linear goals. They might want to hit 100K to 1 million. And at the same time, there is a sense of let things go through. I would love to know what your experience is. It's a very open-ended question, but I would love to know how you uh, take this forward.
Yeah. Well, so I had a really interesting experience the other week of a state of consciousness that was very expansive, infinitely so. And it was understood in that experience that this body mind system that we have, number one, it represents a tiny percentage of what we actually are. And what that thing actually is, I don't know. You can call it consciousness or the infinite intelligence, but that's just another concept and that kind of rarefies it into a thing. It's not a thing. It's formless, timeless, boundless. I don't know what it is. But from that perspective, it was very clearly seen what this body mind system actually is. Now, we tend to identify with our ego and our story and all the narratives, the sensations, the sense of doership, the arrows of attention that kind of make up this sense of self. But the reality is, none of that is actually us. And it's a misunderstanding, and it creates a sense of a solid, separate character that moves through space time and that is separate from all else. What this actually is, this body mind system, it's a gift. And it serves two purposes. Now, this is just a theory that is in progress. I'm not saying this is absolute truth or anything like this. It's just kind of what I experienced in that state. The first purpose for this is so that the infinite can experience the finite in the 10,000 things, the myriad forms. Like the Tao Te Ching says, nameless, it is the origin of all things. Named, it is the mother of 10,000 things. So the conceptual sort of linear domain versus the non-linear pure beingness. The second thing that was clear was that this gift that enables us to experience everything is sort of like a divine tuning fork where we can tune into the specific reality that we would like to live, and we can allow that to come into our lives, because whatever that is, there's a sort of a felt understanding that it wants us to experience joy, happiness, abundance, love. It wants us to experience anything that we desire. And this human realm, this 3D sort of earth realm, is for us to experience and to desire and to taste and connect. So if you want to experience something in the 3D, go ahead. Have a great time doing it. But just never fall into the trap of believing that your worth has anything to do with the outcome or how you perform in the process. And that goes back to some of our earlier conversations about motivation. It goes from being this thing where it's like, I need to do this to prove that this individual self is worth a damn to the world. It goes from being that to just being, let me follow my joy without expectation of result and see where it takes me. So it goes from being very complex, very contracted, and very conditional to just being an expression of joy. And yeah, that makes things a lot sweeter. Yeah.
I don't know, I'm at a loss for words right now. It's incredible when that sentence captures it fully. It's the infinite trying to experiencing the finite. People have even said it as the universe experiencing itself. But I think this statement captures it better. It's beautiful. And the formlessness, duality that you touched upon. Duality is something I've been fascinated with for a while. The masculine, the feminine. I don't mean it gender-wise, I mean it energetically. The yin, the yang, light, dark, formlessness, emptiness, fullness. Would it be right in saying that the mind in some way is related to the masculine, which is related to formlessness, which is related to emptiness, and the heart is more of form, and then fullness, and the feminine, or because even in terms of meditation, there are, I think, practices which try to empty yourself. I see that there are, if you look at the origin of the word yoga, for example, yoga as in yoga, right? Yoga means I am everything. So yoga is an experience of fullness, that everythingness. While nirvana, I might be wrong here, but nirvana is a way of experiencing absolute emptiness, which creates space for the fullness to enter itself. I know even duality is a construct we use to navigate reality better. If you were to look at these paths, because some I've realized in my last conversation with Matt, especially, that my nature, while I was drawn to the mind sort of path, the emptying itself, it just felt like the dry, dreary desert where I couldn't really see meaning. It just felt dry, and I could see through things. I could see through reality, the structures governing us, my own structures. But the question became, for what? For why? I'm nothing. And then rather than feeling empowering, that felt diminishing, that felt degrading in some way. So, do you think there is something about a human's nature? I understand this is a very involved question and I've been building upon it. But based on experience, do you think this duality has any practical importance that someone is choose between them, or can they both coexist?
First of all, I think if you take the path purely of insight, it is very dry. Particularly, it works for some people, like very analytical, naturally, intellectual people. It works very well for people who are just very dry. But for me, like when I walked that path, I realized it made me feel brittle, made me feel fragile because we're not monks. We're men of the world. You know, I'm a dad. I got like very little sleep last night and I'm interacting with people. And I feel that when we step into the shamatha practices, where we create tranquility, where we create equanimity, we create loving kindness and softness in the mind body system, this allows us to interact with the world in a far more pleasant and enjoyable way because we're not speed running to have some sort of insight or breakthrough. It's more of a path of devotion, of love, of connection, of acceptance, of compassion. So just as to your point there, I've experienced that same thing. Yeah, a lot. And many people have. I remember reading about it a lot online. And yeah, I realized that for me, because I did like Vipassana, and it was very dry desert. Yeah, like you said, it felt barren. And then I switched to cultivating the jhanas through the breath, and that was so nourishing and so energizing and so beautifully harmonizing. And I was like, walking through the world like, yeah, buddy, hey, what's going on? Hey, just so sort of like alive and sort of vibrant, and life became much more juicy. Like for me, that was way better.
This was a beautiful answer, and it's very validating for me as well, since it's easy to fall into guilt patterns regarding practices as well. Certain tradition sort of tries to brute force you into their thing that this is the right path, and if something's going wrong, the technique is right because it's proven over a span of 2,500 years. So it must be that's doing something wrong. Consult the teacher. But then coming back to the Hinayana versus Mahayana mindset, I would say this was something that has struck me very deeply, right? And it's still something I hold on to. So, Mahayana, the angle is that I don't want to, let's say, speed run my liberation process. I instead want to feel it out. I want to develop my qualities, levels of compassion, metta, renunciation, nikama, and all those paramis, right? And I'll essentially live through life and try to take as many souls as I can through many lifetimes towards liberation. And initially, when I was going through the Vipassana paths, when I was speed running through courses and then doing serving at them, this stuck me so deeply. I couldn't explain it logically. That the whole Hinani path of I'll just liberate myself. Essentially, I liberating myself also sounds, again, it goes back to the ego suicide point. But this, I couldn't describe it to anyone else. I couldn't explain it, but this appealed to me. It's almost as if I could willingly, if I were given a choice, let's say, that would you want to stay now and this is the path that will take you to liberation? This is exactly what you need to do and it's guaranteed. Versus a path where you might have to live another 100 lifetimes, but you stand to guide many, many people along the way towards liberation with you. I would choose the second in a heartbeat. And I don't know why I'm even saying that, right? So do you think there is a karmic mandate? There is some innate nature which might, even in your case, as you see, the one's drawn towards the heart. In some way, it takes one to the level of unconditional love, unconditional joy, which is technically lower than the unconditional peace point. But do you feel that there is something else which is like, hold up, you have more work to do in the world, in reality, in existence, before you dissolve into the whatever we don't know, the beyond. It's more of an exploration rather than a question. I would love to know what your experience with this has been.
The thing that comes to mind hearing all of this is most of that is occurring within imagination. Like, I feel like if you were to have like a doksan in Zen where you meet with the teacher and you were to ask all of that, he would just say, it's like, cut right through it all. Don't concern yourself with all of that. Because that's really complicated. But what we are is simplicity itself. That's authentically arises. We can get very much lost in the source of. It's kind of again, it's more of who we think we should be or what we should do. But do we have the courage to just abandon all of those ideas and to rest in what remains?
Yeah, see what you mean. Sometimes it's the spiritual ego itself which tries to, again, that sense of I, which tries to create itself through other means. I see this destiny idea also being excited by a longer, greater destiny. Even all these, it's beautiful. I love how you cut through all of that without answering it. And I think with Vipassana, especially given how my mind tends to be very analytical, it can, I think it worsened it all for me. The base tendencies of over analyzing. That's not how Vipassana is supposed to be done. I do realize, but that's what seems to have happened. Is that I can see deeper, and then the dreary desert part also. It's really good to hear that. I heard that from Matt as well. He's been through a similar experience. You have had a similar experience as well. And lately, there has been a lot of emphasis on surrender. You have seen new age gurus coming up and just people being somehow drawn towards or pulled towards surrender itself. And on a different tangent, coming back to the masculine feminine, the reason I'm fascinated with that is traditionally the parts of the mind, so to say, have ruled for whatever millennia and everything, right? People developing insight and trying to become monks, renunciates, and everything. And now I think there's more of a return to source that just surrender and let things pan out as they have to. Even David Hawkins, Surrender the Path of Letting Go versus Maharishika Preeti, she also recommends that you surrender to love itself, which is a true. I remember you responding to a tweet I'd put out, which just occurred to me out of the blue. That love is just strong nuclear force. It is what holds together the fabric of reality itself. Do you think
Hmm.
there's more of a, do you feel there is more of a cosmic shift itself happening, a larger shift towards surrender, or because the levels of chaos, as you can see, the rate at which things are changing is so rapid now. There's very little predictability anymore. Or do you see it as a more of an individual level thing that's happening?
Well, I don't think things ever were predictable. I think things always are in flux, in chaos, unknown, uncertain. I don't know. I honestly don't pay attention to the news, brother. I don't really browse Twitter. I post and turn it off. I think there does seem to be like an evolution of consciousness, but that's somewhat inevitable with so much information out there. And I think naturally as humans we gravitate towards authenticity and truth. I can hear my baby daughter. She's banging on my door saying, "Hello." Can you hear her? Hello, love. Yeah, it's so funny yesterday. Like to answer all that, just be like her. Like don't be like her, but observe her, and that's truth right there. Baby and the Buddha have the same mind, non-conceptual. So funny, man. Like I watch her. I watch her. She's a big inspiration actually because I watch her play. I watch her interact with the world, and it's pure. The first time I held her, because in Malaysia, what happens is for Chinese families, my wife's Chinese, well, she's Chinese Malaysian. She went to a confinement center, which is basically like a really nice home where they have 24/7 nursing staff who look after the baby for you, or rather look after you while you're looking after the baby, give you free square meals a day. And for the first month, the mother is in this confinement center. And the dad is allowed to go and visit once a day. And I remember going and visiting my baby for the first time and picking her up and just seeing how precious and tender and soft and so barely existing she was on a level of consciousness. And I went home and just copied that state of meditation that she was in. And it was the deepest state of meditation I had been in for a while, where you come right, because what you see is that perception requires craving. And the subtle states of mind, the jhanas, the immaterial jhanas that you sink into, it's like consciousness starts to dim, like a light going out. And the less craving that there is, the less perception there is until eventually it goes, and it turns off. Consciousness turns off for a split second. But when I look at her play, it's just, she's purely in the senses, pure perception, zero interpretation. No putting anything in a box, no trying to understand, just enjoying it as it is. And I feel like we could, as adults, learn a lot from that because it can be that simple. It is that simple.
That's beautiful to hear, and just her chipping in into the conversation at the exact right time for you to point out is beautiful. Babies have a wisdom. And this brings up the point of parenthood, especially when people are down the seeking route. And again, this is just pop culture, which has made it seem that way, especially with these reasons where people are copying out of having children, for example.
Mm.
How was your journey been that? Was it a choice? Was it something that just happened? Or did you go through those phases where you're considering why bring children into a world that's already suffering? You know, the Hinayanic argument of sorts. There's so much suffering, so why bring new life into it? The life denying side of it, essentially.
Yeah, I never really considered about the sort of the wider suffering of the world because, again, that's not really my experience. I feel like, it's paradoxical because we must acknowledge that, yes, people are struggling in the world. But at the same time, it's not my experience that life is suffering. There is suffering, but it's mostly a choice and it's mostly conditioned. If you're willing to let go of the conditions, then you could live in a sort of relatively non suffering way. Actually, it was interesting because my wife always wanted kids. So we've been together now for 12 years. We met in university. First week in, I saw her in the student union bar. A light shone down upon her in my perception and told me to go and speak to her. I'm like a redneck, pretty much, where I grew up in England. It's like redneck country, or we call it Janner country. And I had never seen an Asian person before. And I saw her in a group of 15, and she just stood out. And so I went and spoke to her. She thought I was going to bottle her because I was like, I had a shaved head. I was like lifting weights all the time. I just like bottle of, it wasn't alcohol. I didn't drink. It was, I can't remember. She thought I was going to bottle her because a Russian guy had bottled a Malaysian in that same university like a month before. So she was scared shitless. And anyway, that one conversation led to us eventually moving to Japan together. And it got to a point where she was like, I'm getting older. I want to have children. And for me, I wasn't ready for it. And she illuminated in me that that part that wasn't ready was actually still a part which hadn't been liberated. It was a part of the ego. They call it avoidant dismissive attachment style. Because I wasn't, as a young child, I wasn't given the love and attention I required as a very young child. And I would just say I grew up in a very loving family, but my dad was away on business a lot. So he was a bit distant. And my mum was out working on the herb farm because we grew up on a beautiful smallholding. And so I wasn't quite given that love and attention that I required to the degree that I required it. And so when I was very young, I formed this root core belief that I can't rely on anybody. And the way that it manifested, I can't rely on people for love. I had to be like a lone wolf. I had to walk my own path. And the way that that manifested is whenever a girl would get too close, I'd push them away. I had like 5 different girlfriends and they would get too close and I'd get this incredibly claustrophobic feeling. And I didn't know what it was. And I'd be like, all of a sudden, I just felt this like repulsion towards them. And I would usually be about a month or a month and a half in. And I would kind of say, I would break it off. And when I met my wife now, it was my first proper relationship, honestly. The way that it was manifesting was with children. Whenever we'd have this discussion, I'd find myself getting very defensive and closed off. And I was like, what the hell's going on here? This is so interesting. And so what she did eventually, it came to breaking point. We had a lot of arguments about this, just to be completely transparent. Her storming out on the mountain. We were living on a mountain in Nagasaki, her storming out into the mountain somewhere. I'd be running out and getting her at like 3 a.m. It was a mess. It was messy. That's what trauma does. It creates lots of mess. And it was weird because in every other area of my life, I was experiencing relative joy and like bliss and connection. But there was just this one part which was still very messy. And so she very wisely figured out what was going on and dumped some psychological literature on my desk. She said, read this. I read through it. And it was about attachment styles. And I was specifically avoided dismissive attachment style. I was reading it and I was like, because I was at a point where I'm very reasonable and I was reading it, like, oh, yeah, that is exactly what I'm experiencing. So I went back and went through all these different experiences where I felt I'd been betrayed in love. And there was like one time in junior high school or secondary school, we call it. There was another time when I was younger. There was one more time, but then there was this root experience when I was a very young child. And I saw that I was crying and crying and crying as like a baby or like a toddler, and nobody came. And that's where that root pain was embedded in the mind body system. And I gave myself tremendous compassion and I saw sorry for what it was, cried, and then boom, that behavioral pattern was gone. Took about 20 minutes. And from there, all of the friction that we were experiencing in our relationship that was related to this root pain went away. And I was like, okay, let's have children.
That's an incredible story. It's beautiful because I resonate so much with it. It's the same with me and girlfriends. I had a
Mm.
proper serious relation for 2 years, and I was the one to convince her parents, convince my parents, and they were all, down for us to get married. They were all supportive. Out of the blue, I pulled the card that, oh, all the achievements are done. So I'll just, get the fuck out of here. Don't do it blatantly, right? You do it subtly because there's a lot of self-deception that happens. You want to make it
Yes.
happen as if, I'm not fucking it up myself. It's just happening that way. So that there's no guilt of abandoning someone. I think the fear of abandonment also carries with it a lot of guilt of abandoning someone as well. So I experienced that, and now as I've been healing through, until this conversation happened, I used to see healing as something separate and self-integration as separate, but now I think they're actually the same. This raising of consciousness is maybe just letting go of the trauma, and letting go of the trauma raises a consciousness, which probably helps you let go of trauma more. And the psycho-spiritual side of it, especially since you mentioned psychology as well, the work to be done, how much of is it really about spiritual practices, and how much of it is about more, a psychological way of doing things?
I think they're the same thing, but I think you're exactly right when you said the way that you raise consciousness is not by spiritually practicing your way up there. The spiritual practices provide the foundation of awareness and introspective capacity to actually analyze what's going on so that you can go inwardly like a surgeon and start working with it. A very loving surgeon, of course. And you can, that's what the spiritual path is. It's all shadow work, to a supreme degree. It's like the system I use is thoughts, useless, waste product, tension, good, because when you're free of tension, your mind naturally becomes quiet. So feel free of attention, which is just sensations. You can call it fear, anger, anxiety, whatever, but it's all sensations with a narrative wrapped around it. Feel through that, get rid of the narrative and just let it be as it is, the raw sensations, feel through it. Now go into the beliefs. What is the belief that's driving the tension? What is the should that you are living through? And that's the work right there. And it'll be like, oh, yeah, I thought I should be X way because it implies that to a part of me that if I get that, then I'm lovable, I'm enough, I'm whole. Yeah, so the whole path is pretty much shadow work and working through the stuff that we'd rather avoid looking at.
You calling
Requires real
thoughts
radical honesty.
You calling thoughts useless is fascinating because one of the most delightful, liberating discoveries through the path for me has been you can actually talk, walk, and strategize and do a lot of things without needing thoughts at all. There have been times where, even now as we are speaking, the mind is mostly empty. It's not
Yeah.
as empty as it could be, but then there is something, and it's fascinating because I think we are grown up to, we're told to be great thinkers. We're told to hone our thinking ability. That thoughts are what drive our actions. Your thoughts shape your actions and so on. But I'm seeing that's not true at all. The thoughts, even if they don't exist, when they don't exist, especially after Vipassana courses, the mind is relatively empty. I can speak so coherently and articulately and truthfully, and there is no narrative happening. There isn't any processing happening. But then coming to the intellect and intuition, let's say the spontaneous being, would it be right in saying that it's best for the intuition to lead? That's your true self, that you just feel what you have to do and then use intellect as a tool, let's say, in a bounded manner. Maybe something requires using an intellect to brainstorm. In terms of navigating life, do thoughts have any utility anywhere at all?
I made a post the other day and I said, how much thinking do you need to live a beautiful life? Almost zero. How much feeling do you need to live a beautiful life? Infinitely more than you're doing right now. And it's like, yeah, we can learn to navigate our way. I call it returning to divine monkey, where we go from being this human being who's thinking all the time and analyzing and boxing things in and separating and judging. And it's all, what do they say in a Wolf of Wall Street? He's like, it's all above the shoulders, acidic mustard type shit, or whatever he says. Now, his method for getting back into the body is, jerking off and cocaine. Not recommended. Get back into the body. So, what's really interesting is that we find that the mind, the body, and the breath are kind of separate in many people. So, a big thing I emphasize is bringing those three things back together. Like my whole mindfulness system I've developed is all about pretty much not working with thoughts, but working with getting back into the body, finding your anchor in the body, making the body emotional again. The times where you feel like the most kind of spontaneous, expansive, blissful, beautiful connection with people is not when you're thinking. That slows everything down. That creates distortion and lag. But it's when you're deeply in your body and you're operating from pure feeling, from intuition, listening to your heart, listening to your gut. That's all you need. Like an animal, like a baby. Literally, it's like you feel primal. You feel connected to an intelligence that goes beyond the capacity of the logical mind. and you're just like an animal. You're just like feeling your way through life, deeply in your body, deeply grounded, deeply present in the senses.
This senses. That's interesting. Wouldn't this be a renunciation of insight of some sorts?
A renunciation of insight.
Yeah, as in the whole observing yourself, trying to see what the whole mechanism is, deconstructing. I'm coming more from the Vipassana angle, right? To the fact that the claim that mind purification happens only through self-observation. And even the jhanas, the what they say is that they're just concentration, absorption of the mind, and they're not permanent and all that. What has your experience been of that? Is this a sort of renunciation of insight itself, renunciation of self knowledge for, let's say, just going through life and trusting in a source which can figure everything out? I think that's where the whole devotion comes from. I realize that I don't need to know myself or about myself. I only need to know what to do in a moment to moment basis and just how to function. Would that be right in saying that? How's your experience been, especially with those Vipassana habits that sort of kick in, right?
What is it they say in Zen? Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. I think the point where we abandon all the fancy ideas of spirituality and we become like a beautiful divine human ape thing where it's just so simple and you just live. And there's a specific quote which comes to mind, which I can't quite remember right now. It's by a guy called Arthur. I'll see if I can find it quickly. Arthur, I can't remember what his second name is, but he's a really powerful guy. I can't find it, but the point of it is essentially forget about spirituality. It's all just a human construct. It's a useful construct to a point, but do you have the courage to let it go? That's the essence of all of this. Like we're talking a lot of like kind of like discussions and concepts, and I guess the invitation is just can you let all that go and rest in what remains? Even Nisargadatta said something to somebody who came in with these grand spiritual designs. He was like, go back to your home, be a husband, go to your job, do this, do that. He's basically saying go and live. That's the highest spiritual practice. I don't know. I mean, look, for me, I'm not saying that any of this is right or wrong, but in my own experience, when you're in that grounded simplicity, just being, it feels like truth.
That's truth. That's exactly how I would have worded it. I've never been able to word it that way because I tend to get lost in concepts. It's all changing again. It's again a path which had to, be. It's fascinating how, as you say, this gift seems to be the universe knows how to use this gift the way it's meant to be. So there's nothing I have to do essentially. The load, the burden, it reminds me of a quote that I came across. It's beautiful. You are only meant to climb the mountains you're carrying. And that shows that the burden, it's not meant to be carried at all. It was never meant to be carried. It was just meant to. And I think it comes from the sense of, especially once you have gone through trauma in early life. I lost my dad when I was young. There's that separation trauma, and my parents used to fight and all that. And I had an emotionally unavailable mother, still do. So that craving of love, that feminine love especially, it just leads to all these concepts and paths and everything. It's all such a long-winded path back to our own self. Reminds me of what David Data says in The Way of the Superior Man as well. What we're seeking is our own self, but what
Yes.
every man is seeking is his own self, but it often suspiciously looks like a woman. I find that fascinating. Yeah, I think he uses the word his own tail. So it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think we're always in 99% of what we are doing, including even if it's hatred or resistance or separation or whatever, we are ultimately looking for the wholeness that is our nature. That's what we're looking for in all that we do. We just take these incredibly long winded ways to arrive there, even spirituality.
Yeah, it brings to mind a quote that I shared with Matt as well, Matt Laudet. So I'd love to know what you think of it. It says, the past was fate, the present is free will, and the future is destiny. I mean, when things were getting too complex, this is the one thing I've stuck to that held on to that. This makes sense. Whatever the intellectual mind craves, the whole sense of everything, this makes sense and just let go of everything. And I think it's a potent excuse to escape life, even. Much of spirituality today, the neo Advaitin practices, they just tell you that you can just escape everything. You're not the soul, you're not the body, you're not responsible for this mind body complexes actions in the real world. Let it all happen. Ethics are a construct, good, bad is a positionality. Would you agree with that? That non dualism, especially this whole nothing matters mentality, can be a potent cope, the difference between detachment and dissociation, for example, and nihilism versus just, I think, just seeing the mystery of it all, essentially. That
I think anything can be a way of avoiding. Anything can be non-duality, spirituality, weed, porn, booze, whatever. It can all be an avoidance mechanism or a way of trying to bypass feeling something. Because feeling is not always pleasant, but it is entirely necessary. And as to your quote, I think it is a beautiful quote. And as to simplicity, and as to when the intellectual mind, conceptual mind gets too hectic, I would just say, what is the one thing that you can be certain about in your experience right now of life?
That there's something from within which just, I don't know if it receives, if it generates. That's again conceptual. But there has undoubtedly been something that has been guiding me, and it knows what the right thing is, and there's no explanation, logic, whatever needed. This is one thing I can be absolutely certain of because of the evidence I've seen all throughout my life.
Okay, but we're quite deep in the realm of concepts there. We're talking about me, my life, my past, this thing. What's the one thing right now that you could be certain of in this immediate experience of reality?
That I guess I'm alive, I exist. That's it.
Yeah, that's what the I am is pointing to.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's a liberating conversation. I'm so glad to have had this. It's genuinely a blessing to have had the chance to sit with you, talk to you. And for those of us watching, I'm certain a lot of the A types would be here. What would be the best way to explore working with you, to talking to you, or where do people approach? How do they start? And you said you're not working with ones in shame and other levels. So currently, who would be the kind of person who would benefit the most from working with you right now?
So the people who I currently work with, who I've decided to work with, are high performers who have achieved a level of external success, but recognize that their internal state is now the limiting factor to them accessing, to really being able to feel the beautiful life that they've created and perform at a level that they didn't think was possible. It's guys who have sort of, a lot of the guys who I work with, they're multi six-figure 9 to 5ers or entrepreneurs, 7 figures, 8 figure CEOs, execs, guys who have achieved a level of external success, have started to turn inwardly, are confused by how much chaos and how much, there's no clear way, right? And so we sort of pick and choose this and that. Doesn't really ever sink deep enough to kind of hit home. Maybe you've been to therapy, found that ineffective. Maybe you've downloaded a bit of Headspace or Calm and done a few meditations, but nothing's resulted in real transformation. Maybe you've had a bit of a taste, but you want to go deeper. That's the kind of man who I work with. Yeah. And those are the type of people who I enjoy working with because they have the right mentality and their curiosity starting to bloom and blossom. I would say that this conversation is not necessarily a good representation of what we do. What we do is really just getting into your internal world. And much like if you've got a room or a house full of trash that's starting to stink real bad, we'll just go through and start to take out the trash, and which means less and less thinking about yourself, less and less anxiety, and less stress, tension, more and more openness, presence, connection with the now. What we typically experience or see is that things like you'll sleep better, you'll connect deeper with your wife and children, you'll be more present, you'll start to experience joy again, you'll start to flow in your work, you'll start to experience more expansive states of consciousness. Pretty much all the niggling health issues that you've got will start to dissolve away, because that's all a process of tension and being like this all the time. Chemically, you'll shift as well from cortisol and adrenaline to serotonin, dopamine, and life will just get infinitely sweeter.
Thank you so much for that. And finally, to close, for those of us, let's say my own self, right? Ones who might not be at that level of external success yet, but accurately match the archetype of who you're describing. For
Mm.
these who are, let's say, the younger folks who have not yet had the life experience to get there, but are on that path, for those, what would your recommendation be, given that ones who can't work with you, but would still want to gain some of the insights and implement some of the practices of which you might have?
I'd say get Letting Go by David Hawkins so that you can understand your emotional landscape. I would say commit to a practice that works, like a meditation practice. Do at least 20 minutes a day and be willing to examine. Recognize that your thoughts are useless. Dissolve the tension by allowing it and start to work with your beliefs and start unpacking them one by one. And yeah, what you'll experience is ever greater degrees of freedom, peace, joy, love, and connection as you do so. Be willing to feel, be willing to suffer, and it's completely okay to suffer, and tap into your inherent wholeness, and it will all make sense.
Thank you so much for this conversation. And anyone watching this, you will find all of Lee's links in the description, his socials, his programs, and everything. And yeah, thank you so much for appearing here and gracing the conversation, gracing the podcast as well. I'm certain anyone who will watch this will find a lot of value. Thank you. Take care. Much love and Godspeed. You helped me a lot as well just by appearing here. So really, really grateful to you. Thank you,
Thank you
Lee.
so much, Barbara. It was a pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to have this conversation and sending tremendous love to you.